dolor. So that is, it's a Latin word which means basically pain. And so basically, this is where demons attack people physically. Now, there's two kinds of people that get attacked physically. There's those who are possessed or have oppression, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. And that's because there's something in their life that needs to get cleaned up. But then the dolor only happens to people who are very saintly, very holy. So like Padre Pio would get physically beaten by Satan and drug around the room and things of that sort. You'd also see the Saint John Vianney. The same thing happened to him. Paul of the Cross. That's some of the authors in the past say that that's actually what Saint Paul was referring to when he prayed to God 3 times to take away this demon, and Christ said, "My grace is enough for you," which is important because people who suffer that, exorcism isn't going to help. All they have to do is pray and rely on God's grace to get through those particular moments. And God allows it for the humiliation of the demon, even though the demon just wants to take it out on the person because they hate people who are holy. But he'll allow it so that the demon gets humiliated by the person's faithfulness. And then he also uses it for the person themselves to advance in holiness and self-detachment and things of that sort. So it's rare. I've never seen an authentic case of it myself. I've only read about them.
Oppression.
So oppression is attacking people from in relationship to their externals. It's an attack from the outside. So this includes things like destroying their finances, both their inflows. They can block people's, getting paid when they're supposed to be getting paid. They can block or they can cause damage to their property and things like that. So they're just hemorrhaging money all over the place, even though they shouldn't be. They can also attack their property to where, like one family that I've worked with in the past, it wasn't until we discovered that there was this demon in the actual property, and we found out who was getting him there, that he actually that it was the demon in the property that was causing them all their appliances. They would just go through appliances and get a brand new refrigerator. Within a month, boom, it's shot. Their stove would go out. The washing machines and stuff like that, they would just destroy. He was destroying everything. That can also affect their relationships. So this is why we'll see people all of a sudden, they might have a fantastic marriage, and then they might be cursed by somebody, and then all of a sudden, boom, the oppression sets in, and then all of a sudden things are just miserable between the two, and a lot of times they can't necessarily pin it on what either one of them actually did, but they'll destroy people's relationships.
What do you mean cursed by somebody?
So somebody can actually do a ritual, which is like basically an offering to Satan, or do something to empower the demons to come and afflict a particular individual.
A human being can do that?
Yes, they can.
Is that common?
It's common enough to where I see it about 3 or 4 times a year where people have been cursed. It's becoming more common now because more people are getting involved in Satanism and witchcraft. So as that tends to get worse, oppression, and that's one of the, because we keep statistics, the amount of oppression is drastically on the rise because of the increase in the involvement in the occult. And
how do you defend against that? Would you know? Is there any way to know if somebody on earth is cursing you?
Well, the way that you're going to usually know it is that it's probably a curse, is that nobody in the family has done anything sinful to bring the oppression on, because oppression can also be caused by sinful behavior. One of the primary ways that we see an increase in oppression is guys watching pornography that's been cursed, and then they bring that into their family, and then because and then they suffer the oppression for having watched this stuff that's been cursed. But the way that you
hold on. Sorry. Yeah. You mean they actually curse the content that they're watching?
Yeah. So what happens is it was the Satanists in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that taught the people in Hollywood that if you curse the master copy, all of the subsequent copies made from that will bear the curse and it can influence people. That was then also taught to the people in the music industry. And the reason they were doing it is to boost the addictive effect of the music. This is why, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, you'll walk into some like Walmart or something, not that I would recommend it, but you go into Walmart and there's playing some tune and you come out and you can't get that tune out of your head. So then what I would do is when I would notice that, I would just say a short binding prayer against any demon causing that in, and boom, it would stop. So they also taught this, though, that gets the Hollywood people then talking to the people, because one of the epicenters of pornography production is in California. So they taught them to curse this as well. They taught the Satanists taught them to curse this, and it'll make the pornography more addictive. And so that's why you see that. It's one of the reasons why it's more, there's an uptick in it. The curse, depending on the particular individual, can have varying degrees of the influence as a result of that. So we see a lot of people that have oppression as a result of watching this cursed pornography. We're also seeing obsession, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But once in a while, you'll see people actually become possessed. So I knew one case, it wasn't my particular case, because I do a lot of consultation with exorcists, where this guy had watched a piece of pornography and became possessed as a result of it. When this exorcist got him into the session and got the demon to tell him what was the cause of the possession, he said pornography. So then he asked the guy, did you watch pornography? He said, yeah, I did. And he said, well, what happened? He said, I don't know. I said, all I know is that once I watched that piece of pornography, I became completely obsessed with the woman that was in the pornography. And so I spent all my time trying to find her in all the other forms of pornography that I could find where she had acted in it. And so, and he'd become possessed as a result of it. So the curse can actually have its effect. Now, the way curses normally work is there has to be a vulnerability on our part for the curse to actually take place. And that can be anything from, you're committing some seriously sinful act and that's your opening door and the demon gets in from the curse. Or it can also be some minor defect that we particularly have, like, or some failing that we did. I actually, speaking of curses, I actually had one of the exorcists that trained me asked me to take a look at this one case, and he said, she's possessed. So I said, okay, well, I'll go talk to her, because he said he couldn't get to her. So I went, and when I saw her, I said, yeah, she's possessed. It's pretty clear. She's getting occult knowledge but she likes it. So I told her, look, I can't help you unless you're willing to cut bait with these demons. I can't help you. So she says, no, I still want it. So I said, okay, well, if you change your mind, I'll be willing to help. Well, I left. The next day I came down with the worst case of gout I've ever come down with in my entire life. I could not. A week later, usually if I got gout when I was younger, I would just cut out dairy and then boom, it would go away. Well, there was no change in this thing. I even took those pills that take out the uric acid, no change. Then it just dawned on me, I wonder if this woman, a week later, if this woman didn't curse me. So I did a minor exorcism over myself and boom, it was going. So I called the exorcist that had trained me, and he didn't answer. 2 weeks later, he calls me. He says, oh, I would have gotten back to you, but I have had the worst case of gout I've ever had in my entire life. I said, let me guess. Right foot, big toe. He says, yeah, how did you know? I said, dude, you were cursed. And so what was the vulnerability? The vulnerability is anytime I do this work, I always make sure that there's a prayer of protection I say before I do that. And I had failed to do that when I went in to talk to this lady. And that left me unprotected when I walked in. I just walked in thinking, well, I can talk to her and size this up without having to depend on Christ for my protection. Not that was consciously going on, but that was the upshot of it. A year later, another priest called me and says, I think she's had a change of mind. Would you talk to her? I said, yeah, I'll talk to her. But this time when I went in, I said a prayer of protection. I asked St. Michael to protect me. And then I said a prayer which was taught to me by an exorcist, which was, Jesus, if this person tries to curse me, I ask you that if it's your holy will, it be sent back from whence it came. But in either case, keep me protected. So I said that prayer. Walk in, talk to her. She still wants the occult knowledge that she was getting. I gave her the same story. Can't help you. If you change your mind, let me know. I left. A week later, nothing had happened. And then I asked, so I called up the priest and said, well, what happened? And he said, well, just after you left, she ended up in the hospital, which tells you two things. This is one of the reasons why people who are very high up in the occult arts, generally speaking, do not like getting involved in cursing other people because they know they can become subject to the curse that they do. The second part of it is that that Christ hears our prayer. He honored that prayer.
Would you say the occult, is there a difference between the occult and Satanism?
Well, cult is more of a genus. The species would be like specific kinds of witchcraft or specific kinds of Satanism.
Okay. And when we're talking about, when you had brought up the 30s, 40s, and 50s in Hollywood.
Yeah.
And then that infiltrate, and then that cursing, cursing the content. And then they taught the music industry and they taught the porn industry.
Right.
I mean, that just makes me think of Disney.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as we know.
Just about every kid in the country watches Disney.
Yeah.
Watched Disney. I grew up watching Disney.
Yeah.
And I mean, and I know it's real. I mean, I remember, I don't know, probably in my 20s, everybody started talking about the cover of The Little Mermaid and how there was a penis as one of the towers,
Right,
and
yeah.
and there was something in Aladdin that spelled sex, and
Right.
one of the guys got an erection, and there's all these little parts in these movies that have some type of perversion to them.
Yes.
Is that a curse? What is that?
Well, actually, the technical term that we tend to use for that is called the revealing of the method. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
I haven't.
Basically, it basically means that it can be connected to a curse. They could curse this so that it has a more so that its distribution becomes more extensive and more people watch the thing. But a lot of times, what that is that the thing about Satanists, and also even though it's occult and the fact that it's hidden, there's a side to diabolic psychology that even when they remain hidden, they still want to show themselves in some way. They're still going to reveal themselves in something. They can't help it. And it's the same thing you see. It's the same thing you see with Satanists. It's the same thing you see with Freemasons when they're involved in certain things. It's the same stuff you see across the board in these particular groups. And so they just tend to reveal stuff. But their hope is to, even in the revealing, that you don't know. There's a sadistic delight they get out of basically putting it to you without you even knowing it.
How much of the country or the world, I mean, is this affecting? So many people watch,
Oh yeah, I think it's
listen.
I think it's affecting just large percentage of the population. Somebody once asked me, what percentage of the adult population is diabolically obsessed, and I had to think about it a little bit. And then the number that came to me was about 25% of the adult population in this country, at least, is diabolically obsessed. So I asked several other exorcists without giving them my number, and they all came up with the same number. About 25% of the adult population is diabolically obsessed in our culture. So it's having a huge impact. Part of the other difficulty is that most people don't realize is that if something's been cursed, or if there is something evil in a particular like movie or in a video or something of that sort, or even in an audio, each time it's played, it's offensive to God. And as a result, the demons gain empowerment through it. So if you have a sex scene in a movie, if it's replicated on a million screens, God's offended every single time that thing appears on any screen. And so that really does gain the demon's power. And this is one of the reasons why the demons will do everything they can to maintain immorality in certain areas, usually in the areas of the sixth commandment, or as we were talking about pedophilia, which is really empowering to the demons, especially when the pedophilia involves killing a child in ritualistic sacrifice. The demons they really gain a certain amount of power of that. And then they also gain power just out of our sinfulness and things of that sort. But this is how they become empowered through those particular things.
You had mentioned the woman that you were talking about earlier. She had occult knowledge
Yeah.
that the way you made it sound, it just appeared in her mind. She
Yeah,
just
that's right.
like it like a download or something. What
Right.
what is that? What is occult knowledge?
It's basically demons can feed people two kinds of information. So occult knowledge is of two kinds. The first is they can just put an image in your imagination about what's happening in another location. Or what if a demon is putting a thought in someone's head, they can actually put the thought in someone else's head and tell this person this is what this guy's thinking. So they can, that's you see that somewhat commonly. So they can give us particular knowledge about things that are actually happening. Then this can be even through a person's history. So they can, you walk in and all of a sudden, if the person is possessed, they can the demons will just, if they're manifested, they'll start telling you about things that have happened in your history and you've never even met this person. So it deals with particular knowledge. The other kind is,
Could that be the other side as well?
in what sense?
Could the good side could God send somebody to read your mind?
Yes, they can. It's called divine revelation. That can happen, but it's extraordinarily rare. And just as the demons can put stuff in our minds, our guardian angels and angels can put stuff in our minds as well for the good, to kind of clue us in and things of that sort. The other form is kind of a generalized knowledge of it's like a science. So demons can actually teach people things about how like physical things work. I'm personally convinced that even though I'm kind of a fan of a lot of his work, is Tesla. When Tesla was coming up with all these ideas, I'm like, how would this guy come up? And he actually describes how his inventions would come into his mind all completely, the design all complete at once, instantaneously. It wasn't that he thought, okay, if I do this and I put this together and put this, it wasn't that. It was just whoop, the whole thing comes together in his mind. That's how demons actually communicate the knowledge to him. And there is some report. I'm still trying to track down the veracity of it, but there's a report that he was actually involved in spiritualism. Which is a form of the occult. But anyway, so they can give us those kinds of knowledge. And you see this like in cases in session, people who have not had any serious theological training. When the demons are talking, they're making theological distinctions that, someone who has my level of study knows, but the person who's possessed has no clue what it means. In fact, sometimes they'll come out of the session and they're like, what does that mean? They don't even know what it means, but it's actually very, it's at a level that and it's very clear and it's very precise, and their distinctions, their wording is done in such a way that you realize, okay, this is somebody who knows something occultly. This is not a human being.
Obsession.
So obsession is when they attack our interior faculties, specifically the imagination and emotions again. But unlike ordinary temptation, this is extraordinary, where it's very powerful and very strong. And the pattern that you'll tend to see with that is the person it'll just switch on and it just switches off. If it's a psychological condition, it will tend to be, it'll switch on because something external happens and the person just reacts to it. Or it'll be because psychological illnesses involved intellectual and other kinds of habits, it's consistent and it tends to act that way. So the person's always thinking about this. Whereas when it's diabolic obsession, all of a sudden, boom, they're thinking about something. They can't get their mind off of it. And then, they might pray or they might do something else, and then boom, it shuts off. And so that's kind of the pattern that you tend to see. It'll switch on, it switches off. But it's the demon sees the person's imagination and they can't think outside the box. It's like they get tunnel vision and everything they see is seen in that light. Then they can also move people's emotions independently of what's in our imagination, because the way we're designed psychologically is our emotions are moved by the perspective of the image that we have in our imagination. So, for example, in a guy's first marriage, his perspective on his wife is she's lovable, she's nice, she's kind to me. It's a good perspective, right? She's just, look, she brought my beer, she's such a great wife, etc. 10 years later, after they've had a lot of knockdown, drag-out fights, the perspective, she hasn't changed, but the perspective has changed. And so he has a different emotional reaction when she walks into the room. And that's how we can actually change our emotional states just by what the perspective we take on it. Well, the demons can put that perspective on it, but what they can, and they can do that in diabolic obsession, which they often do, and we call it running commentary, where it doesn't matter what the person tries to reason in relationship to, and I don't know, this person's not like that way. Yeah, but then there's the demon just keeps dragging it back to that perspective. But the other thing is they can move the emotions without anything in the imagination. So a person just all of a sudden, boom, they're just angry. And you're like, why are you angry? I don't know. I don't know why I'm mad, right? And then it shuts off just as quickly. So sometimes, like you pray over people who are diabolically obsessed. When you pray over them, all of a sudden they feel this lifting of that perspective and that emotional state. They just feel it lift. And then they seem liberated. And then eventually it'll kind of set back in. In most cases, once in a while, it'll stop altogether. But how entrenched the obsession is or how strong it is going to determine how long of a period of lucidity they're going to have. So if you pray over them and then, for a half a day, they're like, man, I feel great. I'm not thinking about this anymore, and they can engage in normal things. And then it starts to slowly slip back in. Well, then that tells you it's pretty strong. Whereas if it goes a week or two and then it sits back in, then that means it's pretty light. And you just have to do certain things to get it blown out.
Does that mean it leaves and comes back, or is it still in there?
So the way obsession works is that there's what they call a period of crisis and a period of lucidity. So once a person is diabolically obsessed, unless they do specific spiritual things to get rid of it, it's going to persist where they're going to go through periods of crisis where they're obsessing about these particular things. They can't get their mind off. It can be anger or fear, or it can be anything, self-loathing. It can be all sorts of things. Or even, that's why it's self-hatred. I tell people, look, that's what demons do. You got to stop it. But then there's also, then they go through a period of lucidity where they might have a day or two where they feel fine again and they seem okay, and then it sets back in. And so that's the general pattern you're going to see. The longer it goes on, they're going to spiral downwards, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And eventually it gets to the point where they don't have hardly any periods of lucidity. And it's usually at that point that the demons will drive them to do something in that obsession. And the person's become weaker through that process. Of giving into it and ruminating about it, because each time they give into the thought, they're empowering the demon to stay there. So over the course of time, it gets to the point where the person, excuse me, spirals downward, and then demons will convince them to do something that's gravely sinful, and that opens the door to possession, and that's their goal.
Possession.
Okay, so possession is where demons actually take possession of a part of the body or the whole. And so there's two kinds of possession. There's perfect possession where the person has given themselves over to the demon entirely, and then the demon possesses the whole body, and the demon is manifested all the time. Now, we don't necessarily notice that, and we can't necessarily tell. The way you're going to know it is by what we call secondary signs of possession, like malice, mendacity, animus delendi. It doesn't matter. Every time this person got that, there was a politician who every time I saw this guy, I said, this guy's got to be possessed, because every single thing he did maximized damage within his capacity to do so. Right. And so you'll see those kinds of things, even though they don't preternaturally manifest, like they're not going to morph into something, or show occult knowledge or any type of thing. Everywhere and in each situation they're in, they just cause damage or cause difficulties. Mendacity, just a variety. So there's a number of different secondary signs. But that's perfect possession, which is rare. And the exorcists never see those, because those people are not interested in getting liberated, because they actually like the possession, because the demon's giving them something as a result of a little perk for it.
So they realize they're possessed. They
Yes,
understand that they're...
Yes. They know, because at a certain point he reveals himself to him and says, if you give me possession, or give me your soul, or whatever the case is, then I will give you X in return for it. And then the person, by that time though, perfect possessions don't happen until the person has gotten to the point where they've given into the normal possession for some time. So that's perfect possession. Then there's partial possession. And that's where the demons only possess a part of the body, and they'll only manifest during part of the time. And so the demon's not necessarily in the driver's seat all the time. And so they go through periods of crisis and lucidity as well. And so those are the different kinds of possession. And possession is, you can have a number of different possessors in a case. Sometimes you get just one demon possessing. Sometimes you'll get legion You know, I've had a case where it was actually Legion. I'm like, yeah, I can see it because this woman was a walking vacuum cleaner. It didn't matter who she was around. She picked up that person's diabolic baggage. But then it can also be, you know, as I mentioned, they're all different kinds of possessors. You know, be Satan, Lucifer, Beelzebub, Baal, the generals which we talked about or mentioned. It can be just a number of different ones of them. And then also possession is by degree. And so you can have somebody who might be possessed by a fair number of demons, but you can get them out pretty quickly. Others might just be one or two possessors, but you have to grind on it for a long period of time.